Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Genesis 31. So we're talking about Laban's wages and dysfunctional finances. It's the dysfunction we're going to talk about today. It seems that Laban's great character flaw was that he valued people in terms of material wealth. So after Rachel had her firstborn son, Jacob's 7 years of dowry were completed. He had worked for Laban for a total of 14 years, and he decided it was time for him to leave. But Laban asked him to stay, and the specific reason that Laban gave was because Jacob was directly responsible for the increase of Laban's material wealth. You can see that verse 27 of chapter 30. Although Laban's motives were not explicitly stated until this point in the story, it is likely that they were the underlying reason for his actions concerning his daughters. So by giving Leah to Jacob before giving Rachel to him, Laban secured Jacob's work for another 7 years. And it seems that he gave little thought of what kind of emotional effect his decisions would have upon his daughters personally or upon his family unit. Jacob agreed to work for his father-in-law for another 7 years, this time in exchange for portions of the flock. A simple wage was agreed upon, so solid-colored animals would belong to Laban. Those that were striped, spotted, or speckled would belong to Jacob. Immediately after this wage agreement, Laban took all of the male and female goats that were striped and multicolored and separated them from his flocks. He placed those animals under the care of his sons and separated the animals in an attempt to keep them from producing anything other than solid-colored sheep and goats. Later on, we discover that Laban changed Jacob's wages 10 times in an attempt to keep him from having any increase. Because the Lord was with Jacob, each time Laban changed his wages, the animals would produce the new wage agreement, and Jacob's wealth grew. When Jacob fell out of favor with Laban, mostly due to Jacob's incredible increase of wealth, Jacob decided to take his family and leave. Laban pursued him with a group of men, and even though he eventually agreed to allow Jacob to leave, we hear Laban's distorted value system and his greed on display. It says in verse 43, "Then Laban replied to Jacob, 'These women are my daughters, these children are my grandchildren, and these flocks are my flocks. In fact, everything you see is mine. But what can I do now about my daughters and their children?'" We have our own way of valuing people in terms of material wealth. We might stay at the office instead of romancing our spouse on an anniversary date. We might choose to work late instead of attending our son's ball game. We might be inauthentic with someone at work just because of their position in the company. So what is the solution when our value system for our loved ones is dysfunctional? Be careful when you are dealing with God's people. When Laban was pursuing after Jacob, the Lord appeared to Laban in a dream with a warning. "I'm warning you, leave Jacob alone," verse 24, chapter 31. The highest value you can place upon a loved one is the recognition that he or she belongs to God. Then in verse 49 it says, "May the Lord keep watch between us to make sure that we keep this covenant when we are out of each other's sight." These were the words that Laban spoke when he and Jacob agreed to make a covenant of peace and settle the disagreement about their wealth. We probably can't view this as a conversion of Laban's heart, but it is clear that Jacob and Laban made this covenant in the sight and in the fear of the Lord. To commit a family member to the care and justice of God, so the Lord keeps watch between us, is to surrender one's control over that person. Alyssa, so what are some other examples maybe that you could give of how we misplace value systems on our loved ones?
As I was thinking about this, it's so easy maybe to look outside of people that don't have our beliefs and see how their values mess up things. But I think it's much more profitable for us when we're looking at things to look at maybe how Christians mess up and how maybe other people in the Bible have messed up their value systems. I look at Jonah, and maybe this wasn't his loved ones, but he placed such a high value on God's judgment that and thought that when he delivered this message that there would be this judgment that fell, and when there wasn't, he got so mad because he valued the judgment of God more than the grace of God. And I think that we can see that in our lives when people do wrong things and they're shown grace that maybe we don't think they deserve, and we get mad at it because why are they receiving this grace? They need to receive what they deserve. We look at David and how he didn't really care that much when Tamar was raped by her own brother, and he cared more about the son than the daughter because of probably that value system back then, and how sons were valued more, and all of that, and it led to such dysfunction there with and if you need the story of that, go back to episode 1 of the From Rage to Righteousness sermon, and that's talked about more, where this misplaced value of caring about a daughter in great need and not worrying about it just led to horrible things happening, and anger and murder and all the things that we think belong on like an HBO show, but they actually are in the Bible. Some maybe more modern examples would be being too reliant on God in the face of illness or need, and being like, God's going to take care of it. God's going to take care of it. And not taking the steps that we need maybe to seek the medical care for us or for our loved ones. I know some sects of Christianity rely so heavily on that they won't go seek medical treatment, and they will find themselves in much greater medical need because they didn't take those steps that were obvious maybe to some of us. People can let their political views and ideologies affect relationships beyond what they should, instead of maybe just letting them be known and then being like, but you are my son, you're my daughter, I love you, let's just continue to have a relationship, and we will leave this behind us. And they let that turn into a sticking point where they are like, nope, I'm not going to have a relationship with you anymore.
Politics is horrible right now. And we do not need to go down that trail.
No,
it's a horrible environment.
I don't think we do, but I mean,
it's a horrible environment. Well, I've said this before. We are in the evangelical church, and frankly, the non-evangelical church, more committed to our politics than we are to our Jesus, in a lot of ways, and it's somewhat scary. The one I was thinking about is reputation.
Okay.
As a parent, often we're more concerned about how that child acts because of how it's going to reflect on us than we are whether it's best for them or whether they even understand, why we want them to act a particular way. And sometimes it's like I'll give you a funny example, and I'm going to talk about reputation, because reputation, I think, becomes a misplaced value. When I was a kid, when we would go visit my grandmother, my mom would buy us these ridiculously stiff, I would call them Bobo tennis shoes. They call them other things now, and I have no idea what the current term is, but if we had a pair of sneakers that we liked, we usually were wearing them all the time, everywhere, and they looked worn. And my mom was so concerned about what my grandmother was going to think about what we were wearing that she would go buy us shoes that we hated, that we were embarrassed to wear to her house, so that, as she wanted her mother-in-law to think she took care of us, that we dress nice. And there are probably some other times, where reputation becomes more important. The other side of that is sometimes when we feel like our reputation is marred, we will resort to lying or sin to try to cover our self so people will think highly of us or better of us or disguise. We were talking about this show I was watching recently. The people go to great lengths, to try to prop themselves up, and it's just a misplaced priority where we get caught up in the example that I was given about staying at work late or overworking. I think may be the most easily identifiable sin where we get things out of balance. As men, one of the things that we want to do is provide. We feel like we do provide. That doesn't take away from a spouse working, a wife working. That's not what I mean. But I think in general, most men feel fulfilled when they feel like they're providing for their family. And what my experience is, I just read this in a book recently. As a matter of fact, it's a book I just finished yesterday. And the guy was talking about how he worked all the time. And he had these businesses he was starting. And in the beginning, his excuse was, I'm doing this for my family. But at some point, there became this tipping point where they were wealthy. The business was good. They had more than they could have imagined. But he was still working those same hours. And his wife walked in his office one day and said, look, you can no longer say you're doing this for us, right? This is no longer about us. You're not doing this to put a roof over our head or send the kids to college or prepare for our retirement. That's already done. You're doing this for you now. And I think sometimes our value becomes misplaced easily in those moments around money, and we don't realize it.
It's easy to get caught up at work. And so, I mean, in some ways, Tyler and I, our roles in some things are a little flip-flopped because he works from home and is getting his doctoral degree online. So like all of his work is done at home. So he cooks dinner and I'm the one that's like, hey, I'll be home at this time for dinner. And then I'll get caught in a conversation and I'm like, I'm running late. And then dinner's cold and I'm picking up the kid late and all of that. And it creates this tension because while I'm seeing it as I got caught, there was nothing I could do to get out of this conversation. Like I was just trying to finish up an extra 5 minutes of work, and it creates that tension there where, the values, we're seeing different values at that moment, and we're not seeing eye to eye. And it's not something that is crazy. We have worked through that many different times, and we've come to much better place with that. But it does create that tension when there's a different value that you're trying to worry about at that particular moment, and you just aren't seeing eye to eye with your spouse.
And you have to figure out how to get that back in check at times. And in those cases, it's a balance. Trying to find that give and take where everybody or one of you don't feel wounded all of the time.
Right.
They're not coming out on the
right. You have to remember that you're working towards the same goal, even when, like, I mean, I think your story is when that continues, but in those small moments, you have to realize that you're both working towards the goal of, a happy, healthy family, and the bigger picture matters, and to give each other a little bit of grace when that happens. But yeah, that if that was to continue and I was just to be later and later and later and just be like, oh, you know what, it doesn't matter that, dinner is ready, I'm just going to keep going and not care, then that becomes the issue.
We put value on money. In your case, both of you work. In our case, I'm the only income earner, typically the only income earner. And if we're not careful, when there's one income earner or one makes more than the other, we use that as leverage dangerously. I've seen it happen way too many times. That's a conversation that typically doesn't invade our home, but I know in a lot of places it does. It becomes a leverage point because we put so much value on money. If we're greedy and stingy, does that indicate we view life in this limited mindset and we don't want them to be blessed, because we're afraid we're going to miss out on something?
Right. What is the phrase that is?
It wasn't coming to me right then.
Oh, goodness.
The one is an abundance mindset.
Right.
The other one is it's not
like
poverty.
A limited resource type idea, like that there is only X number of dollars in the world, and if I don't take these dollars, then...
Or if they get these dollars...
If they get those dollars, and I won't have them.
That's right, I won't have access.
Right, and I think you see that when you see that greed, this might be a really weird example. In social media, when somebody comes up with an idea that maybe is making them some money and it's getting them maybe a little bit of fame, which kind of leads to like brand deals and, payments and all of that. And some people get so possessive of that idea, and then somebody else copies that idea and they're so mad about that because maybe they're going to get a piece of that pie. But what actually happens when somebody who has a great idea uses it and other people maybe replicate and do other things is it builds that idea and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and that abundance grows for everybody because that idea that they came up with, that creative idea that's creating them money, now is creating them more money because it's become a bigger thing that more people know. Like thinking of an idea and freely sharing those ideas, it helps everything grow. And I think that's the same with wealth and all of those, that we have to realize that there's more out there than we could possibly ever use in our entire lifetimes. And just because somebody else has something doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to receive it.
I want to say it's a mark of maturity, but it's not always. I think that there are people who do this easier than other people. There are people who are able to cheer no matter what anybody gets. They're excited that they got blessed. And then there are other people who, every time somebody else gets something, they're criticizing it. I don't understand. I don't know. I deserve that, right? I should have gotten that. I that should have been my idea, or I thought about that. My son has said 100 times to me. He said, I had this idea for these, the new ketchup packets. Well, they're not
the dipping ones.
Yeah. He said, I had this idea a long time ago. He said, I just never did anything with it. And I laugh at him. I say, that's
how long ago? Because those were at Chick-fil-A when I worked there, which is quite a long time ago.
I have no idea. It's just funny how sometimes we may have the idea. We just don't take action upon it. That's the difference often between people who receive and people who don't, is they take action. They take some kind of risk that is inherent in putting themselves out there. And
those are really cool ketchup packets.
They are. That's a great improvement, a huge improvement.
How did they not think of that before?
I hate going somewhere and getting the old ketchup packets now because they come out of a box where some of them have already busted and they're sticky and gross and but it just takes, it's not just the idea though. You've got to act upon it. And that's the difference often, is most of the time that frustration I hear from people is because they weren't willing to pull the trigger to do something different. They have some kind of regret in their life. And stinginess, by the way, is not a characteristic of God.
No.
And we need to get it out of our life. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around dysfunction from the book of Genesis.